Hello, young scholars. This is Mr. Martirone, and in today's segment of the Flip Classroom, I'm going to speak very briefly to you guys about the Columbian Exchange and the slave and triangle trade. So, in your notes, you want to have you want to be open to those pages, and we're going to begin our discussion. So, what was the Columbian Exchange? Well, the Columbian Exchange was the exchange of goods across the Atlantic Ocean. So what happens is after Columbus discovers the New World, or after it's confirmed that there is a new landmass or continent there, uh, the explorers begin making their way across the Atlantic Ocean. And eventually colonies are established that we've talked about, and those colonies begin producing raw materials that are sent back to Europe. So what ends up happening is that the raw materials are sent over the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Now, at this time, England and France and Germany are beginning to industrialize. So they are taking these raw materials and they are producing manufactured goods. And these manufactured goods are then sent back to the colonies and they are sold to the colonists. So some of the things that were traded in this Columbian Exchange from the Americas to Europe: tomatoes, pumpkins, peppers, corn, and potatoes. A lot of people don't realize that tomatoes, pumpkin, peppers, corn, and potatoes were not native to Europe. And it's really neat to think that, Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or even Galileo never had a tomato, never saw a pumpkin, never ate corn, simply because it had never been brought back at this point in world history. So it's very, very unique to think about it. Additionally, materials such as wheat, grapes, pigs, cattle, goats, horses, and donkeys were brought from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas. It's very neat to think that one of the largest crops that the United States produces is wheat, and in fact, that wasn't native to the Americas. Also, horses and goats and donkeys, something that we thrive off of today in our culture, again, that was not native to the Americas. That was all brought over by the Europeans during this age of exploration. Another concept, and this is just a kind of a more detailed chart. So from Europe, we'll follow this little chart, from Europe to Africa, little trinkets, liquor, and guns was sent to the Africans. And from Africa, look at all the resources that were sent to the Americas: olives, onions, grapes, citrus fruit, cattle, flu, diphtheria, coffee beans, turnips, peach, pear, sheep, typhoid, whooping cough, bananas, honeybees, sugarcane, wheat, pigs, measles, rice, barley, oats, the horse, smallpox, and malaria. All of these things down here made their way across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. The big thing, and we've been talking in class, was the age of exploration beneficial, or was it a travesty in mankind's history? A lot of ideas were exchanged. And anytime you have two cultures exchanging and meeting for the first time, there's going to be repercussions. Some of those repercussions are in the fact that flu, diphtheria, typhoid, and whooping cough, and measles and smallpox and malaria were all exposed or given to Native Americans for the very first time. From the Americas to Europe: squash, turkey, coca, peanuts, avocados, pumpkins, pineapples, tomato, syphilis, peppers, tobacco, kavasa, vanilla, sweet potatoes, quinine, potato, and maize. Those were all things that biologists and historians believe were never native to Europe. So it was the first time it was an exposure there. So this age of exploration really opens up these new materials and new resources for this part of the world. Another thing that's traded is human cargo, and the travesties of the slave trade cannot be understated. So during the 17th century, Europeans wanted workers for their colonies, and they were working on the colonies because their chief exports were sugarcane, rice, tobacco, and cotton. The Portuguese were the first to use slaves, and they enslaved Native Americans. And because of mistreatment and disease, the Native Americans died. So then the Portuguese brought over Africans to work in Brazil. And very simply put, there's a lot of different theories about how the ideas of slavery began. Some people think it was because the Europeans saw other Africans enslaving each other. But when we come down to it, it comes down to the idea of racial superiority, that the Europeans in the 17th and 1600s or 16th century felt that they were superior than the Africans. And as a result of this, African culture is lost because of the slave trade. One of the things that we don't get a chance to go too in-depthly is that the African culture prior to the Renaissance, prior to the 1400s, was a thriving culture in Central Africa. And as a result of the slave trade, families are ripped apart, and tribes and the rich cultural history of the Africans is lost to us, and it will be changed forever. All right. Here is an illustration showing kind of the first encounters between the Native Americans and whites and Europeans as they exchange the ideas, and they also exchange brides in this instance, showing the mistreatment of the Europeans with the natives. Okay. I just want you guys to look at the slave trade by the numbers. In the early 1500s, there were roughly 2,000 Africans that were sent to the Americas. Now, again, these are rough estimates based on the available data and primary sources. 280 years, almost 300 years later, that number jumps to 80,000 slaves were traded. 80,000. Tremendous number. And then by the year 1800, it was estimated that over 11 million slaves were sent to the Americas. And you have to ask yourself, what big change happens in the late 1700s and early 1800s? Well, quite simply, that's the American Revolution. And because the Americas are now free from Great Britain by the late 1700s, many of the southern states and southern plantations were using slaves in their plantations to turn a profit. This image is a pretty popular image for teachers to show their students. Again, slaves were not considered human beings. Now, in the 21st century, we know that obviously they were, but they were treated as human cargo. And the cargo ships were loaded. The slaves were packed below the decks. They were chained together. They were shackled with their ankles together, sometimes their hands. Sometimes they were shackled together around their neck, around their collarbone. And they were put in these crammed quarters where they were forced to endure as they traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. And we all know that crossing took about 3.5 to 4 weeks, depending on the weather. So these are very horrid and unthinkable conditions that these people had to endure. Also, if you're looking at this drawing, if you're looking at this sketch, one of the things is that the racial stereotype that has the slaves portrayed as almost inhuman. And again, this was to dehumanize them so that people would not think of them as human, but think of them as property and as cargo. This is one of the worst travesties. That's an example of man's inhumanity to man. The triangle trade worked as follows. Traders brought goods to Africa to be traded for slaves. Okay, that was step one. Step two is that Africans were sent via the Middle Passage to the West Indies. Step three, while in the West Indies, slaves were exchanged for sugar, molasses, and other products. And finally, step four, those products were eventually shipped back to Europe or to other colonies. So again, step one, slaves are traded in Africa. Human cargo is purchased and bought. Step two, the slaves are shipped across the South Atlantic to the Americas. Step three, the slaves are now working on plantations step 4, the materials they produce are shipped back to Europe so that European merchants and bankers can generate a profit. And here is an image. This is not the Columbian Exchange, but this is the triangle slave trade. So here, Europe sends textiles, raw and manufactured goods to Africa. Africa, in exchange, sends slaves to the Americas. And then sugar, tobacco, and cotton are sent from the Americas back to Europe, where the triangle repeats itself. And this system of trade continues for about 250 years. And it is accelerated by the inventions of the Industrial Revolution in England. All right. If you feel I went a little bit too fast, or if you need to see anything again, please do not hesitate to watch this film again, or you can post in the discussion board on Edmodo.